So today we'll be talking about Chapter 6, Section 2. And the title of this is Foreign Affairs Trouble the Nation. If you look at the textbook when you're reading this evening, you'll see a big painting. And it's a famous painting of the French Revolution, of the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a French prison containing political prisoners. They could put anyone in there for any reason and hold them indefinitely. And it became a symbol of everything that was wrong with France. And so the French citizens stood up to the leaders of the country, the wealthy, the powerful, the rich, the untouchable, and they stormed the high establishments, killing even the king and the queen and everyone with wealth and power. It was the French Revolution. It was an exciting time, but it was also a rather disturbing time for our country, and it was the first major foreign policy crisis that our new nation had to face. And so we're going to start with a little story about the French Revolution today in the latter part of the 1700s. Yesterday we talked about the beginning of political parties in our country. We learned about how the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist had extreme differences over the size and power of the federal government. And now we're going to see those differences. So the Federalists, who believed in this strong central government, who distrusted the common person to be able to make important decisions for themselves, tended to side with the British in their war against France. As we've talked, Britain and France were at war with one another throughout the centuries, and it was not uncommon. But when the French Revolution occurred, and the poor rose up against the rich, and the spirit of revolution just took fire in the country, and their slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, equality for all was the foundation of a French democracy. But it was also kind of scary because the people, the poor, just rose up. It's almost like the Arab Spring, rose up and killed the wealthy and the powerful, and the guillotine was used to great effect. In fact, it was a French device invented during the time of the French Revolution. They started killing off all the wealthy and powerful. They called them the bourgeoisie and labeled them enemies. And this led to a scary time in France called the Reign of Terror, where a group called the Jacobins decided that anyone who was wealthy and powerful, anyone who would try to deprive the people of rights, needed to die. And they declared war on all monarchies, particularly Britain, their ancient enemy. And so France, again, at war with Great Britain. In the United States, George Washington, our president, said, "We're staying out of this. Not our fight." Declared neutrality. Meanwhile, our country was divided. There were a number of people who said that we need to help the French. There were a number of people who said, no, these French people are scary, we need to help the British. It was a divisive issue, not unlike what's going on with Syria today. Some people saying, we need to help the Syrians. Some people saying, oh no, we're staying out of this. And here we are. We're again split along, guess what? Party lines. The Federalists supported the British, who wanted to maintain stability, who didn't trust the Jacobins because they're killing all the rich people. And the rich people, according to the Federalists, are supposed to be the rulers of society. Meanwhile, the Democratic Republicans, remember the Anti-Federalists, Thomas Jefferson, the little government people, they were all about the French. They said, okay, what the French people are doing, cutting heads off, kind of scary. However, they are representing a movement of democracy, a movement of the people, by the people, and for the people. And even though their methods might be creepy, we need to support this idea. Meanwhile, the president, who obviously is in control of foreign affairs, declares neutrality. He wisely said, we're going to sit this one out, guys. Meanwhile, a French diplomat named Edmond Genet violates our neutrality, comes over to the United States without permission, and starts trying to recruit an army. He says, I know there's a lot of anti-federalists among you. I know there's a lot of people here that support the French cause, and I know that you would be willing to support democracy in France. And so he literally tries to raise an army illegally in the United States. Now, meanwhile, neutrality in foreign policy was a wise choice for a young country because we had many domestic problems of our own. And you could call these foreign issues too, because we had foreign nations living on our borders, and we were encroaching on their borders. And Native Americans were saying, them Americans taking our jobs, and they were taking our land, and they were moving into our territories. And we were. And, of course, the Treaty of Paris, the peace agreement that we made with Great Britain ending the War of the Revolution, included territories that belonged to Native Americans. If you remember, the Native Americans had not been invited to the peace agreement between the United States and Great Britain. And so many Native American tribes did not recognize that treaty because that treaty granted the American colonies lands from the coast all the way to the Mississippi River. Well, that includes the Ohio River Valley. That includes lands west of the Appalachians that the Cherokee claimed. That includes lands that belong to many different Native American tribes that had just been magic wand wave given to the American colonies. And that was unacceptable. In fact, a chief of the Miami tribe named Little Turtle, favorite name in the whole course, Little Turtle, was a war chief. And he had already led several successful campaigns against American armies. So Little Turtle was pretty hardcore. Meanwhile, he was undefeated. And he rallied a number of other tribes. And they called themselves the Miami Confederacy in honor of their leader, Little Turtle, from the Miami tribe. Now, the Miami Confederacy defeated several different American armies. This guy was jacked. I mean, I'm telling you, he's pretty amazing. Somebody needs to pick him for their big project, right? Study of Little Turtle. I don't know much about him, but I'd be very interested to hear because he was able to defeat 2 different American armies sent against him. The third time's the charm, right? Literally on the third time, we sent our very best general. He was called Mad Anthony Wayne. And it was his job to prepare the American army to defeat Little Turtle and the Miami Confederacy. And he drilled and trained his soldiers for over a year. Studied Little Turtle. Trained and prepared his men. And after a year's worth of training, they went after him. And at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the dreams of Little Turtle and the Miami Confederacy of maintaining their independence from the American Imperials.
I cannot take you seriously when you can't either.
At the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, Little Turtle and his Miami Confederacy were soundly defeated by Mad Anthony Wayne. They were forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville, giving up what is today the state of Ohio, because that's what they were fighting over, for a few $1,000s worth of beads and jewelry. True story. As we were growing as a country, we were making treaties with Great Britain and France and Spain, moving into their former colonial possessions. And due to wars in Europe, it became clear that European countries were going to begin to give up their North American territories and not seek to fight for them because there were troubles abroad in Europe related to the French Revolution that we'll get into more in just a moment. And so Great Britain began to relinquish control of their northwestern territories, particularly where they had troops stationed in forts. And they wanted these troops back in Europe to deal with some of the scary issues going on there. And they really didn't want to pick a fight with us because no country wants to fight two wars at the same time. That's a disastrous plan. That's what ruined Hitler. That's what ruined Napoleon. That's what's ruined many of the conquerors throughout history, fighting two wars at the same time. Britain knows better. They don't want to pick a fight with the United States because they know we are beginning to move into these territories, and so they make a treaty with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name is John Jay, made a treaty with Great Britain where the British agreed to evacuate their forts in the Northwestern Territory. In return, they were going to be able to continue the fur trade unopposed. And this angered many Americans because many Americans were beginning to side with the French in this war. And here we are making treaties with the British. So again, the Federalists were all about the British. We wanted to help them. We didn't really care what the French were doing. We supported the British because they represented stability in Western Europe. But again, that revolutionary fervor, the anti-Federalists, the believers in liberty, equality, fraternity, they tended to support the French. But we're going to see where this is going to cause even more division.
In 1794, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay was sent to London on a diplomatic mission. Its main goals were to bring an end to British interference with American trade ships and to clear up a variety of problems, some dating back to the end of the Revolutionary War. Under the treaty that Jay finally negotiated, Britain agreed to turn over forts being used to supply arms to American Indians who were trying to put a stop to U.S. settlement on their lands. These British forts were located in the western Lake Erie region near present-day Detroit and Toledo. Also under Jay's treaty, the United States agreed to stop carrying goods between France and her colonies. In exchange, the U.S. got a few minor concessions from Britain to limit its interference with American trade ships. However, as far as France was concerned, Jay's treaty merely showed that America was far from neutral because of its willingness to give in to British demands. And as a result, an undeclared war broke out between the U.S. and France.
So there's Little Turtle. Telling you, 350. Just say it. Many Native American chiefs wore feathers in their hair, as kind of a badge of honor for defeated enemies. But this is Little Turtle handing over symbolic control of the entire Ohio Valley, which is huge. Essentially the state of Ohio today, one of the breadbaskets of our country. Seriously, if you drive through the state, it's giant farms. As far as you can see, very fertile valley. And this is Matt Anthony Wayne, the colonial general who defeated the Miami Confederacy. So meanwhile, as I said, we are moving westward, for better or worse. And many of these lands had already been claimed by European nations, not to mention the Native American tribes that had lived there forever. But Great Britain, France, and Spain all realize that fighting the Americans for these lands was a bad idea. And so Spain began to negotiate with the United States, in particular Thomas Pinckney, the U.S. minister to Great Britain. And Pinckney's Treaty of 1795, also known as the Treaty of San Lorenzo, you might see either on your quiz or test. In this treaty, called Pinckney's Treaty or the Treaty of San Lorenzo, Spain agreed to give up claims to the western United States. And these were sparsely populated territories at this time. And we're talking about the territories west of the Mississippi. Now, Mexico is going to lay claim to much of this land when Mexico declares its independence from Spain soon. But meanwhile, Spain just agrees they're not going to fight the United States. They're not going to war with the United States over these territories. They also agree that the Florida and U.S. boundary is set at the 31st parallel and the Mississippi River would be open to United States traffic. And so if you remember when, during the Articles of Confederation, the United States was struggling to pay its debts, we owed Spain a lot of money. And because we couldn't pay Spain what we owed them, well, one consequence of that was they closed the Mississippi River to United States traffic. And this was a serious threat to our country because we didn't have railroads. We certainly didn't have semi-trucks. We relied on downriver shipments for transportation. And the Mississippi River was one of the most vital trade routes in our country. Well, it was largely claimed and held by the Spanish. And now with the Treaty of San Lorenzo, we can use it. And that's very, very good for us.
1 year after the Whiskey Rebellion, negotiations on some important issues were underway here in the Kingdom of Spain between royal officials and the representatives of the United States. Under the agreement that was finally worked out, called the Treaty of San Lorenzo, the Spaniards gave up trying to rule an area of disputed land that had been claimed by both the U.S. and Spain. And as a result, thousands of square miles of new territory were added to the United States. This land later became parts of the states of Mississippi and Alabama. In addition, the treaty prevented Spanish military forces from interfering with American trading ships on the Mississippi River. Even beyond that, the Treaty of San Lorenzo allowed American products and products destined for the American West to be loaded and unloaded here in New Orleans, which was then under Spanish control, without being taxed. Having free access to the Mississippi River proved to be extremely important to America because it increased both trade and settlement in the western region of the country. 1 year after the Whiskey Rebellion,
Now, meanwhile, the birth of the two-party system in our country has been very important to understanding American politics. The birth of the two-party system is very important in understanding American politics. And perhaps this is best understood through our first two-party based election. In 1796, we have the very first two-party election in our country's history. We have a Federalist, John Adams, who will go on to be our second president, versus Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. Now, the Constitution allowed for a very strange phenomenon, and that is the president and the vice president can be elected from different parties. So essentially it was whoever won the election became President of the United States. And whoever came in second place became the Vice President of the United States. It's not anymore. This was changed. Yeah, I mean, imagine. However, the Constitution was written before the birth of the two-party system. And so in a single-party election, it makes sense because they would both be Federalist. Yet, now that we have a two-party system, we have a Federalist, John Adams, second President of the United States, as well as an anti-Federalist, Thomas Jefferson, who would later be third President of the United States, but for now he's going to be Vice President. And so they're from different parties. Can you imagine? I mean, in all seriousness. I mean, Trump and Hillary in the same office. Yeah, they don't exactly get along.
That'd be the end of the U.S.
I mean, yeah, like, can you imagine? Now, put our politics aside. Anytime you have two different parties in the same office, it's just kind of bad for business. You know, it's the root of much of the troubles that we have in our legislature today, that not much can get done because we have two different parties in the same building trying to pass laws. And so really this is the result of what we see called sectionalism. And this is what Washington was warning about in his very last speech. He said, and I quote, "Beware of the dangers of sectionalism, because they will divide our country and lead to disunion and civil war." He said, beware of this. And sectionalism is placing the interest of the region of your country above the interest of our nation. And I was thinking about this last night. It's just one of those things that popped in my head. You know, how did we convince independent states to put aside their special interest to become a nation? Because that's what we did with the signing of the Constitution. We convinced North Carolina to stop worrying about just North Carolina and to become a nation, and to put aside its special interest in the interest of a nation. But even though we supposedly did that with the Constitution, what we found was North Carolina still had its special interest and still voted along its special interest. And so did Rhode Island, and so did Massachusetts. And that problem didn't just go away with the signing of the Constitution, even as amazing of a document as it is. It didn't just go away. In fact, that sectional problem will become the American Civil War and will continue to plague and haunt our country, and still continues today. Unfortunately, division in our country didn't just end with the Civil War. It certainly didn't end with the signing of the Constitution. And so we're going to have that nagging problem throughout this course, and that nagging problem we're going to call sectionalism. Now back to Europe. Brief history of the French Revolution. The poor rose up against the rich, killed all the rich and wealthy, literally storming palaces and looting them, cutting kings' heads off. The rest is history. But after the revolution and after the reign of terror, Plato said that pure democracy becomes anarchy, which unfortunately we saw in France. They attempted to restore the monarchy out of a necessity of maintaining stability, and that didn't go so well. And eventually a French military officer named Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power and promised stability. Unfortunately, we see this. When you have a revolution and the people rise up, it often leads to instability. Look at the Arab Spring in 2011. Look at the Mexican Revolution, if you know your Mexican history. Look at many of the different revolutions around the world when the poor rise up against the powerful. And unfortunately, what often happens is anarchy and chaos, followed by a dictator. The dictator who promises stability. Think of Mussolini and Hitler. But in this case, we have Napoleon. Promises stability. Promises peace. And they often use war to unite their people. Because what brings a divided group of people together better than a good old war? Do you know one of the most united times in our country's history was World War II? What brings together a bickering nation better than Nazis? Than a good common enemy to hate? I'm serious. It's sad, but true. Throughout history, a common enemy has united a divided people more so than any other phenomena. Maybe a natural disaster. Sadly, it takes terrible things to bring people together, and war is one of the most expedient and the most controllable of these. And so leaders will use war to bring people together. I mean, really, like think of the Star Wars prequel. Emperor Palpatine used war to unite the Republic, which was divided and scattered, into an empire, and before you know it, stormtroopers, right? Well, France turned to Napoleon, who then created a war and set out to conquer Western Europe. And he dang near pulled it off. And Britain was one of the few countries that was never conquered. Being an island nation has been advantageous to Britain throughout their history. And so Napoleon was never able to conquer Britain. So Britain and France in a terrible war with one another. And the French started to look at the United States as a threat. Gee, haven't we seen this before? World War I and World War II. Same problem, except instead of the Germans, now it's the French, who started to see the Americans as a threat because we were making treaties with their enemy, Great Britain. Again, it's the same problem you'll see in World War I, World War II. And so they started to seize American ships. Again, same problem before we were officially in either one of the world wars. They started to seize our ships. And they started to kidnap our sailors and steal our goods. And we saw this as a serious problem. And so it was a diplomatic crisis. And we hoped to resolve this diplomatically. We sent diplomats to France to discuss this with their new prime minister. And in order for us to even be able to meet with their foreign minister, they demanded a bribe. They demanded a large sum of money for us to even be able to sit down peacefully and talk. And so we were turned away. Our diplomats were turned away. And so we went back, our diplomats came back to the United States and reported that the French minister wanted a bribe. And 1,300 men, I kid you not, showed up at the White House with torches, volunteering to go fight the French. True story. So when word got out that the French wouldn't even talk to us, it led to a wave of anti-French feelings, and it led to an undeclared naval war between France and the United States for 2 years.
During his first year in office, President John Adams sent representatives to Paris to try to negotiate an end to the undeclared war between America and France. But the French demanded that the United States give them bribes before they could even start talking. This event, they came to be called XYZ Affair, insulted the American negotiators so much that they sailed back home and saw to it that their treaties with France were repealed. That same year, in response to the growing threat of war, the ship seemed the USS Constellation was built. The Constellation had 36 cannons and was the first U.S. Navy vessel ever to capture a foreign warship. The ship that it captured belonged to France. As the U.S. Navy was busy putting together its first fleet, President Adams' Federalist Party used its majority in Congress to pass a set of laws called the Alien and Sedition Act, designed to increase their political power. The three alien acts subjected new aliens to unfair treatment and deprived many people who opposed the Federalists of their right to vote.
We'll get into this.
While the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government. And when one newspaper editor suggested that some of John Adams' actions were a lot more like those of a king than a president, the editor was thrown in jail. James Madison, the man who composed the Bill of Rights, was one of the most outspoken critics of the Federalist attempts to undermine basic American freedoms. Madison and Thomas Jefferson both helped write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which proposed that the Alien and Sedition Acts be ignored because they violated the U.S. Constitution. They've suggested that states should always have the right to void unconstitutional federal laws.
So the official press release was known as the XYZ Affair, where these three minor French officials, we're calling them X, Y, and Z because we don't like them, told the American diplomats to go away. And here they are portrayed in a political cartoon from a pro-Federalist newspaper. Remember, the Federalists liked the British and hated the French. And this pro-Federalist newspaper depicted these French officials as a three-headed monster with a knife, threatening war. Now, during this undeclared naval war with France, there was a bit of a media campaign. Think of the Hunger Games, where, different sides are trying to spin the conflict in a different way. The Federalists wanted to portray the French as the enemy. The anti-Federalist Americans wanted to portray this as the Federalists trying to use a conflict and spin it for their own self-interest, for their own gain, and depicted the American Federalist as the enemy. And really it was the British that we needed to fear and not the French. Many Federalists feared that the French would use the anti-Federalists to overthrow the American government. And Federalists were suspicious of many immigrants coming into our country because many of these immigrants coming in became involved with the Democratic Republican Party. And many of these immigrants, and some of them, were outspoken critics of the Federalist system. There were French immigrants coming into our country during this undeclared war with France. And so the Federalists, who were in power at this time, pushed through Congress the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. And the Alien Act, the part of this law, raised residency requirements for U.S. citizenship. So now, because of this undeclared war with France, you had to have lived in the country 7 years before you could become a U.S. citizen. And if caught, you could face deportation or jail. But the sedition part, now the reason they wanted to limit French immigration to the United States was because many of these French immigrants that were fleeing the conflict there had differing political ideas. They didn't believe what the Federalists were saying. And so another part of the law was created, the sedition part. And this allowed our government to place people in jail for publishing works or speaking words that either, quote, hindered or lied about the government. And what effectively this did was allowed our government to put in jail editors of Democratic Republican magazines and newspapers and Democratic Republican politicians. We were putting people from the news, journalists, in jail for publishing works that disagreed with the Federalist idea. So if you're looking for a good group project for this week, be some rebel journalist and be some anti-Federalist journalists, some Democratic Republican journalists, who were publishing works saying that, hey, maybe this war with France was not so legitimate. And for saying those things, they could be thrown in jail for a period of time.
During his first year in office, President John Adams sent representatives to Paris to try to negotiate an end to the undeclared war between America and France. But the French demanded that the United States pay them bribes before they would even start talking. This event, that came to be called the XYZ Affair, insulted the American negotiators so much that they sailed back home and saw to it that old treaties with France were repealed. That same year, in response to the growing threat of war, the ship seen here, the USS Constellation, was built. The Constellation had 36 cannons and was the first U.S. Navy vessel ever to capture a foreign warship. The ship that it captured belonged to France. As the U.S. Navy was busy putting together its first fleet, President Adams' Federalist Party used its majority in Congress to pass a set of laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, designed to increase their political power. The three Alien Acts subjected new immigrants to unfair treatment and deprived many people who opposed the Federalists of their right to vote, while the Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize the U.S. government. And when one newspaper editor suggested that some of John Adams' actions were a lot more like those of a king than a president, the editor was thrown in jail. James Madison, the man who composed the Bill of Rights, was one of the most outspoken critics of the Federalist attempts to undermine basic American freedoms. Madison and Thomas Jefferson both helped write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which proposed that the Alien and Sedition Acts be ignored because they violated the U.S. Constitution. They suggested that states should always have the right to void unconstitutional federal laws.
The ride of their lives. It was London, 2003, when Natalie decided to speak her mind about the impending invasion of Iraq.
Just so you know, we're on the good side with y'all. We do not want war. We're ashamed of the President of the United States.
And those words just
Can you
changed
believe that?
everything for you, right?
Yeah.
I heard this on television, and I went and found it for you guys, where they interviewed bystanders who were reacting to what the Dixie Chicks had said. And again, it was just seared into my memory where this woman, and she had a thick southern accent, just going to tell you. She said, and I quote, "They need to take old Natalie, strap a bomb to her, send her over Iraq." And Natalie was the lead singer of the Dixie Chicks who had dared speak against the American war in Iraq in 2003 and had dared say something against the President George W. Bush. And they started organizing Dixie Chick burn parties where they would burn their CDs. Scary stuff, right? Would this be considered an infringement on free speech? Do you have the right to criticize our country? Certainly you do. Does that remind you of anything? Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts are certainly a violation of our free speech rights. You know, you may disagree with my politics, I may disagree with yours, but as Patrick Henry once said, we may disagree, but I would fight to the death for your right to disagree. And freedom of speech, well, that's just one of those things that we consider as something that makes us American. We have the right to criticize our leaders, and we should. But the Alien and Sedition Acts allowed our government to throw in prison those who disagreed with their beliefs. And there were a couple of states that refused to enforce this law. And they were the states of Virginia and Kentucky. And they said this law violates the Constitution. We are not going to follow it. And as a state, they decided they were going to reject this law. Well, and so this brings up an issue of states' rights. Can a state reject a law passed by the federal government? Technically, no. But they considered it nullification. And nullification, and the theory it's based on, is the idea from John Locke. Remember, one of those ideas of our country that a government is a social contract. If it violates the social contract, if it violates the people's rights, the government loses its right to be a government. And so Virginia and Kentucky said this law violates our natural rights, it violates the First Amendment, and we ain't going to follow it. And they nullified that law in their own states. Now, perhaps lucky for them, perhaps lucky for all of us, George Washington died. And when he died, Napoleon, leader of France at the time, declared 18 days of mourning in respect for our first president. And this resolved the diplomatic crisis that was going on in Europe. This resolved our beef with France, and the Alien and Sedition Acts were later relaxed. So we got over our disagreements with France because of Napoleon's show of respect for our president. And things were worked out with Virginia and Kentucky, and I suppose it had a happy ending. But this theory of nullification is something that we're going to see again and again leading up to the American Civil War.
Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. These are just some of the freedoms granted to American citizens by the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. Adopted in 1791, it protects the rights of citizens and sets limitations on the power of government. These rights are the civic values on which our country was founded. But during times of national crisis or war, the federal government is sometimes faced with a challenge to maintain these ideals. Government power versus citizens' rights. It's an issue that is almost as old as our country itself. During the administration of John Adams, our second president, relations between the U.S. and France were tense. War seemed likely. In response, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These acts gave the president permission to imprison or deport any immigrants considered a threat to national security. They also banned criticism of the government. More than a century later, another president sacrificed citizens' rights in the name of national security. In 1942, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an order that forced more than 110,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps. They had done nothing wrong, but because they were of Japanese descent, they were considered a threat to national security.
We were stripped of our constitutional rights. We had never heard of anything like this happening to any other group because, of course, this was America.